Hey guys, tonight we stand together at the edge of a harbor just as the sun is slipping down, that orange-pink moment when the water looks thick and slow and the air feels heavy with smells you can almost taste. You're right there on the worn wooden planks, boots scuffed, coat hanging loose, watching shadows stretch across crates and coils of rope. Somewhere behind you, a street vendor slaps something sizzling onto a hot surface, and the sound cuts through the gull cries like a small promise. This is the last calm breath before a long voyage, and you already feel that strange tug in your chest, because once the sails go up, food will stop being interesting very quickly. You probably won't survive this if you're expecting 3 meals a day, warm, fresh, and politely plated. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what the local time is. It's oddly comforting to imagine you all scattered across different nights. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're still on the dock and it's early evening. This is the age of sail, somewhere between the 16th and early 19th centuries, when the world is technically connected but practically very far apart. The harbor is alive in that sleepy busy way. Men shouting numbers, ropes creaking, barrels rolling with dull thuds. But what pulls you in isn't the ships themselves. It's the food. Street food, specifically. The kind meant to be eaten standing up, leaning against a post, grease soaking into paper or cloth. Sailors linger here longer than necessary, not because they're bad at time management, but because this is the last chance for a while to eat something that didn't come from a barrel or a biscuit sack. You drift closer to a cluster of stalls near the waterline. There's fried fish, fresh, not salted, its smell cutting through the damp air. This is a mainstream historical reality. Ports across Europe and beyond were famous for cheap, hot food sold directly to laborers and sailors. It wasn't fancy, but it was immediate, and that mattered. You can hear oil popping, a sound that already feels nostalgic, even though you haven't left yet. Someone hands over a coin, someone else hands over a paper-wrapped portion, and the exchange is quick, practiced, and deeply human. You take a bite, and for a second everything slows. The crunch, the heat, the faint burn on your tongue. This is the kind of sensory detail sailors would cling to later, when the horizon becomes nothing but water and sky. Historians still argue whether sailors consciously stockpiled these memories or if nostalgia simply sharpened them over time. But there's no debate that food anchored emotions in powerful ways. Around you, the harbor is a collage of accents and faces. English, Dutch, Portuguese, Spanish, sometimes all in the same stretch of dock. Street foods varied wildly by port, but the feeling was universal. This moment right here is abundance before absence. A quirky tidbit that often gets overlooked is that some sailors would intentionally overeat before departure, not just out of hunger, but out of fear. Fear of monotony. They knew that once at sea, flavor would flatten into salt and starch. You notice a vendor selling something sweet, perhaps a simple pastry, fried dough dusted with sugar. Sugar is still a luxury in many places, tied to global trade routes and colonial plantations. But here it's affordable enough to buy on impulse. You chew slowly, already aware that sweetness will soon become a memory more than a taste. On board, sweetness usually comes in the form of watered-down molasses or dried fruit if you're lucky. And luck, as you'll learn, is relative. The dock itself feels alive under your feet. You can feel the vibration when a cargo net swings, when a gangplank drops into place. Sailors are notorious for last-minute wandering, and captains complain endlessly about it in ship logs. This is another solid historical fact. Delays were common, not just because of weather or paperwork, but because crew members were scattered through nearby streets, squeezing in final pleasures. Food chief among them. There's gentle humor in imagining a hardened sailor, tattooed and scarred, debating whether to buy one more skewer of something grilled. One more bite before months of hardtack. One more smell before everything smells like damp wood and unwashed clothes. You smile at the thought, because you know that feeling too, the one more episode logic of history. As twilight deepens, lanterns flicker on, casting warm circles of light over the stalls. Smoke curls upward, mixing with the briny air. Smell is doing most of the storytelling now. Later, on the open ocean, sailors would swear they could smell these foods in their dreams. Smell, more than sight or sound, has a direct line to memory. Modern neuroscience backs this up, but sailors didn't need brain scans to know it. They just knew that the memory of fried fish could hit harder than the sight of land. There's also an undercurrent of debate here. Historians still argue whether street food was nutritionally significant for sailors or merely emotionally significant. Did these meals meaningfully supplement diets, or were they symbolic farewells to comfort? The answer probably shifts depending on the port, the period, and the sailor's pay. Either way, no one disputes their psychological weight. You finally step back, wiping your hands, feeling the warmth fade as the food settles. Somewhere a bell rings. Time to board. The stalls don't vanish, but they recede, already slipping into the past tense of your mind. You take one last look, knowing that for months, maybe years, this exact combination of smells and sounds will be unreachable. As you walk toward the ship, the harbor noise softens behind you. The deck creaks in a different rhythm, one that promises routine, repetition, and a lot of beige-colored meals. But tucked away in your memory, already glowing faintly, are the street foods of the dock. They'll come back to you later, unexpectedly, in the middle of the night watch, when the sea is flat and the world feels very small. And with that, you climb aboard, carrying not just gear and pay advances, but the quiet comfort of knowing exactly what you'll miss first. The ship eases away with a slow, patient motion, as if even it is reluctant to leave the smells and noise behind. The water slaps gently against the hull, a steady sound that will soon become your nightly lullaby whether you want it or not. For now, though, your attention turns inward, to your stomach, which is full, and to the quiet realization that it won't feel this way again for a very long time. The first meal at sea arrives quickly, not because anyone is eager, but because routine is everything aboard a sailing ship. This is where hardtack makes its entrance, dense and pale, like a biscuit that forgot what joy was supposed to be. Hardtack is a mainstream historical fact of naval and merchant sailing life. Flour, water, baked hard, and then baked again until it could survive months, sometimes years, without spoiling. You pick one up, tap it against the table, and it responds with the confidence of a brick. Somewhere in the back of your mind, a fried fish from the dock waves goodbye. You bite carefully. The taste is neutral in a way that feels almost philosophical. Not bad, exactly, just absent. Sailors often soaked hardtack in water, tea, or even rum to make it chewable, a practice so common it became second nature. There's a quirky tidbit sailors joked about endlessly. Hardtack was sometimes called worm castles because weevils would burrow inside. Many sailors knocked the biscuit against the table to shake the insects out, though others simply ate them, protein being protein when you're far from land. As you chew, your mind drifts back to street food almost immediately. That's the thing about hunger at sea, it's less about calories and more about contrast. Hardtack fills space in your stomach, but it doesn't fill memory. Historians still argue whether sailors truly hated hardtack or simply resented it for what it represented. The beginning of sameness. After all, in survival terms, it worked remarkably well. The deck shifts under your feet as the ship finds its rhythm. Below deck, barrels are stacked like silent sentries. Salted beef, dried peas, oatmeal. These are staples, reliable and dull. You remember how, on the dock, food was hot and unpredictable. You didn't know exactly how crispy the fish would be or how sweet the pastry might taste. At sea, uncertainty belongs to weather and navigation, not to meals. Someone near you cracks a joke about missing street pies already. Laughter ripples softly through the mess area. That low, tired humor sailors specialize in. There's a strange comfort in shared disappointment. You're all missing the same things, and that collective longing becomes part of the ship's culture. Modern people talk about comfort food, but sailors lived it in reverse. Comfort food was what they no longer had. You take another bite of hardtack, slower this time. Texture becomes the main event. Crunch, soak, chew. You realize that memories of street food are sharpening rather than fading. The smell of oil, the warmth of sugar, the quick smile of a vendor. These details float up uninvited. Smell and taste are linked so tightly that even a bland meal can trigger vivid recollection. Historians still argue whether this kind of sensory memory affected morale in measurable ways, but ship logs are full of complaints that hint at it. A fringe detail often overlooked is that some sailors carried small personal stashes of food aboard. dried fruit, nuts, or even spices bought from street vendors just before boarding. Officially discouraged, these private hoards were acts of quiet rebellion against monotony. You imagine a sailor carefully unwrapping a bit of candied peel weeks later, eyes closed, transported for a moment back to the dock. Night settles in fully now. Lantern light flickers across wooden beams, and the ship's sounds grow more intimate. Creaks, sighs, the soft shuffle of boots. Hunger isn't sharp yet, but anticipation is. You know that tomorrow, and the day after, meals will look much like this one. Hardtack, porridge, salted meat. The predictability is almost soothing if you don't think about it too hard. Still, your thoughts wander back to street food, not as indulgence, but as variety. The human brain craves difference as much as nourishment. Historians still argue whether boredom was a greater enemy to sailors than hunger itself. Judging by the songs, jokes, and endless food fantasies recorded in journals, boredom had a powerful appetite. You finish your meal and push the plate away. It's enough. It has to be. As you stand and feel the ship roll beneath you, you understand something important. Street food wasn't just about taste. It was about choice. At the dock, you chose what to eat, when to eat, how fast to eat it. At sea, choice narrows to almost nothing. You head back on deck, breathing in the cool night air. The stars are coming out, steady and indifferent. Somewhere out there is your destination, but right now, what feels furthest away isn't land. It's a warm stall, a hot pan, and the luxury of deciding between savory and sweet. You lean against the rail, letting the rhythm of the waves settle into you. The hunger will come later. For now, memory is doing the work of flavor, keeping you company as the ship carries you farther from the dock and deeper into routine. The days at sea begin to stack quietly on top of one another, like identical plates in a cupboard no one opens anymore. Morning, watch, meal, work, sleep, repeat. Somewhere in this gentle blur, your mind starts to wander more often, and when it does, it almost always wanders back to food. Not the food in front of you, but the food that used to exist in color and heat. Today, without quite meaning to, you find yourself thinking about fish again. Not the salted slabs from a barrel, but the kind that once crackled in oil along Atlantic docks. You picture the ports of the North Atlantic. Lisbon, Bristol, Amsterdam, La Rochelle. These were places where fish wasn't preserved as an act of desperation, but celebrated as something fresh and fleeting. A mainstream historical fact is that coastal cities relied heavily on daily fish markets, with street vendors selling fried or grilled fish to sailors and laborers who needed quick, filling meals. You remember standing there, paper bundle in hand, the oil soaking through faster than expected. At sea, fish arrives in a very different form. Salted cod, hard and pale, soaked for hours to make it chewable. It does the job, nutritionally speaking. Cod, especially, was a backbone of maritime diets because it preserved well. But it doesn't sing. It doesn't crackle. You chew and swallow, and your thoughts drift back to those dockside stalls where fish was cooked within sight of the water it came from. There's a quiet joke among the crew that salted fish tastes like regret. Someone mutters it under their breath, and you smile despite yourself. Humor becomes softer out here, less performative, more like a shared sigh. The quirky tidbit here is that sailors often ranked ports by how good the fish tasted before departure, a kind of informal culinary map passed down through stories rather than charts. As the ship rolls steadily westward, the smell of the ocean is constant, but it's missing something. Fresh fish smells bright and sharp. Preserved fish smells muted, almost apologetic. Smell again proves to be the villain and the hero of memory. You can almost smell hot oil when the wind shifts just right, though you know that's impossible. Historians still argue whether sailors' food memories intensified over time or if they simply became more selective in hindsight, polishing the good and forgetting the bad. You pass time talking with a crewmate who once sailed out of an English port famous for its fish pies. He describes them slowly, with unnecessary detail. The flaky crust, the steam escaping when broken open. You realize he's not just telling a story. He's feeding himself with words. Storytelling becomes a substitute seasoning at sea. In Atlantic ports, fish street food wasn't fancy, but it was regional. In some places, it was battered and fried. In others, grilled with herbs or served with coarse bread. Sailors absorbed these differences without thinking much about it at the time. Only now, in absence, do the distinctions sharpen. You remember that in southern ports, olive oil added a roundness to the flavor, while in northern ports, animal fats made everything heavier and more filling. A fringe detail worth lingering on is that some sailors swore they could tell where a ship had last docked by the way the crew talked about fish. It's probably exaggerated, but it speaks to how deeply food was tied to place. Historians still argue how accurate these anecdotes are, but they appear often enough to suggest there's something there. The sea stretches on, an unbroken field of movement. Meals punctuate the day like quiet bells. When fish appears on your plate now, it's usually grayish, soaked and boiled. You eat it because you must. But as you swallow, you remember the sound of gulls fighting over scraps near a dockside stall, the heat of the pan, the vendor's hands moving quickly from customer to customer. There's something almost meditative about this contrast. You begin to understand that longing itself becomes a kind of companion. It fills space that excitement once occupied. Sailors often described craving specific foods more intensely than they craved land itself. Historians still argue whether that was literal or metaphorical. But either way, the emotional truth feels solid. At night, lying in your narrow berth, the ship breathing around you, fish stalls drift through your dreams. They're brighter than reality, louder, more generous. You wake with the faintest sense of disappointment, then roll over and let the sound of water against the hull soothe you back toward sleep. Somewhere out there, another dock waits with another fish stall, another paper-wrapped meal. For now, you carry the memory instead, letting it soften the edges of salt and routine, and reminding yourself that even the blandest days are anchored to places where flavor once lived. The ship slides into warmer waters, and you feel it before anyone says a word. The air softens, the wind carries a different weight, and suddenly your thoughts turn from fish to bread. Not the hard, apologetic kind you gnaw on daily, but real bread, flat, warm, torn by hand rather than cracked with effort. Mediterranean bread. The kind that arrives glossy with oil, accompanied by olives that shine like small, patient moons. You remember the ports along the Mediterranean rim, Genoa, Naples, Barcelona, Alexandria, where bread wasn't just a side, it was a foundation. A mainstream historical fact is that wheat-based flatbreads were staples of daily life in these regions, sold fresh from ovens that worked almost non-stop. Sailors passing through could buy bread still warm, often brushed with olive oil, sometimes sprinkled with herbs or coarse salt. You recall how it bent instead of snapped, how it smelled faintly sweet and grassy at the same time. At sea, bread becomes a memory lesson. Hardtack technically counts as bread, but only in the way a plank technically counts as furniture. You soak it again today, watching bubbles rise lazily as it softens. As you chew, your mind insists on replaying the Mediterranean version. Soft crumb, crisp edge, oil soaking into your fingers. It's unfair, really, how specific longing can be. Olives join the memory uninvited. Green, black, wrinkled, smooth, each with its own personality. In port, olives were cheap, salty, and endlessly snackable. A quirky tidbit sailors loved to repeat was that olives made you thirsty on purpose, which conveniently encouraged the purchase of more wine. Whether that was clever marketing or coincidence is still up for debate. Historians still argue whether olive consumption among sailors had any meaningful nutritional impact or if it was simply a morale booster disguised as food. You sit on deck during a quiet moment, the sun warm but not oppressive. Someone nearby mentions missing olives specifically, not bread, and you nod without thinking. Salt behaves differently when it's friendly. On board, salt preserves meat and fish by stripping away moisture and joy. In olives, salt feels intentional, balanced by oil and flesh. It's the difference between discipline and hospitality. Mediterranean street food culture thrived on simplicity. Bread, oil, olives, maybe cheese if you were lucky. No plates, no ceremony. Sailors fit right into this rhythm. You could eat standing, leaning, talking, laughing. That freedom is what you miss as much as the flavor. At sea, meals are scheduled, supervised, and largely silent. A fringe detail that often surprises people is how much sailors associated olive oil with calm seas. Some believe that pouring oil on rough water could settle waves, an idea that dates back to ancient times. Whether it actually worked or not, the belief itself was soothing. Historians still argue whether this practice had any physical effect or was purely psychological. But either way, olive oil became symbolically linked with control and comfort. You smile faintly at the thought. If only a drizzle of oil could smooth out the ocean and your dinner at the same time. Instead, you sip water and let your imagination do the smoothing. You picture a narrow street near the port, stone walls holding in warmth, a vendor tearing bread with practiced hands. The sound of it tearing is what gets you. The quiet resistance, the promise of softness. Someone cracks a joke about how olives probably miss you too. It's not a great joke, but it lands because everyone's tired. That makes 3 jokes today if you count the earlier one about hardtack doubling as a weapon. Humor out here is like seasoning. You don't need much, just enough to notice. As the days pass, Mediterranean flavors grow more vivid in your mind, not less. This is the strange math of deprivation. The less you have, the more detailed your memories become. You remember the bitterness of olive skins, the way oil pooled in the creases of bread, the sound of conversation bouncing off stone. You don't remember paying. You don't remember the weight of coins. Only the eating. Historians still argue whether sailors truly romanticized Mediterranean ports more than others, or if the abundance of written sources from these regions skews our perception. But even accounting for bias, it's clear that bread and olives occupied a special place in maritime nostalgia. They were simple, affordable, and deeply tied to place. The sun dips lower, and the sea takes on that glassy look that makes everything feel suspended. You chew another piece of softened hardtack and chase it with a sip of water. It does the job, technically, but your mind is elsewhere, walking streets you may never see again. Fingers oily, lips salty, heart steady. You realize something quietly important. Missing bread and olives isn't about luxury. It's about rhythm. Tear, dip, chew. No hurry. No hierarchy. Just food that fits into life rather than interrupting it. At sea, life is interrupted constantly. By weather, by orders, by hunger itself. As night settles, you lie back and let the ship's motion rock you. Somewhere between wakefulness and sleep, you imagine a loaf cooling on a wooden board, olives waiting in a shallow bowl. The image doesn't make you sad. It makes you patient. And patience out here is its own kind of nourishment. The wind shifts, and with it, the direction of your thoughts. Somewhere far behind you are the Mediterranean docks, their ovens and olive bowls already blurring into something almost mythic. Ahead, at least in memory if not on this exact voyage, are ports shaped by heat, humidity, and spice. Even now, rocking gently on the open sea, your nose seems to remember things your eyes can't see anymore. Spice markets. Street snacks fried, steamed, wrapped in leaves. The kind of food that made you sweat a little even before you took a bite. Before the sails caught the monsoon winds, sailors passing through Indian Ocean ports encountered flavors that felt louder than anything they'd known before. This is a mainstream historical fact. Ports like Calicut, Goa, Malacca, and later Batavia were not just trading hubs for spices, but living kitchens. Street food thrived there, feeding dockworkers, merchants, and sailors with quick dishes built around rice, lentils, chilies, coconut, and oil. You remember standing near a stall, heat rising from the ground, air thick with unfamiliar aromas that somehow felt welcoming rather than overwhelming. At sea, the absence of spice is almost physical. Shipboard food is deliberately bland, partly to preserve it, partly to avoid upsetting stomachs in rough weather. You swallow another mouthful of porridge and realize that what you miss isn't just flavor, it's complexity. Spice makes you pay attention. It wakes you up. Out here, meals are designed to do the opposite. A quirky tidbit sailors loved to repeat was that spicy food made you brave. There was a belief, half joke, half superstition, that those who could handle chilies were better suited for long voyages. Historians still argue whether this belief came from observation, cultural misunderstanding, or simple bravado, but it shows how deeply food was tied to identity. You remember watching a vendor scoop rice with practiced speed, topping it with something sizzling and red. You didn't know the name of the dish, and you still don't. That didn't matter. You ate standing in the shade, sweat beading at your temples, feeling intensely alive. Now, days later, you drink tepid water and imagine that heat again. Not the weather kind, but the internal spark of spice. The ship creaks softly as it cuts through the water. Around you, the crew moves in slow, economical patterns. Nobody rushes anymore. Spice, you realize, also meant energy. Street food in these ports wasn't just sustenance. It was stimulation. The contrast is sharp enough to feel humorous in a tired way. You think about how a single chili would cause absolute chaos in the galley right now. Historians still argue how much access ordinary sailors actually had to these street foods, given language barriers and unfamiliar customs. But travel accounts and ship journals mention them often enough to suggest they made a real impression. Sailors wrote about burning tongues, watering eyes, and the strange pleasure of it all. Pain and delight blurred together, something the sea itself understands well. There's also the memory of coconut. Soft, oily, faintly sweet. In port, it showed up everywhere. Shaved, toasted, pressed into milk. On board, fat is precious, rationed, dull. You chew on salted meat and think about how coconut milk once coated rice, making it rich without being heavy. You wonder briefly if it's possible to miss a texture more than a taste. A light joke drifts through your mind. Somewhere out there, a chili is offended that you ever complained about it. You almost laugh, then remember how laughter travels strangely at sea, echoing longer than intended. You keep it quiet, a smile pressed inward. As night approaches, the air cools just enough to be comfortable. You sit with your back against the rail, letting the memory of spice warm you from the inside. It's a strange reversal. Cool food in hot climates, warm memories in cool nights. The brain does what it can to balance things. Historians still argue whether the global spice trade truly changed sailors' palates long-term or if they reverted to old preferences once home. But for you, right now, the effect is undeniable. Those street foods expanded the range of what you think of as possible. Shipboard meals feel narrower by comparison, like a song stuck on one note. You close your eyes and picture the market again. Colors layered on colors, voices overlapping, oil shimmering in shallow pans. The memory doesn't make you restless. It settles you. It reminds you that the world is wide, even when your current view is nothing but sea. The ship continues forward, steady and indifferent. Spice fades into the background of your thoughts, but it doesn't disappear. It waits, like a jar tucked away in memory, sealed tight, ready to be opened again when land finally rises from the horizon. The coastline shifts again in your memory, drifting south and west, toward places where the land smells different even before you see it. African coastal ports, Gori, Elmina, Zanzibar, Mombasa, come back to you not as points on a map, but as smoke rising into warm air. You remember fire first. Open flames. Charcoal. The steady, patient turning of skewers over grills set right near the water. A mainstream historical fact is that along many African coasts, grilled street food was central to daily life. Fish, goat, chicken, and beef were cooked quickly over open heat, seasoned simply or boldly depending on the region, and sold hot to dockworkers and sailors alike. You remember how close the grills were to the sea, as if the food itself wanted to watch the ships come and go. At sea, meat is pale and resigned. Salted beef arrives in chunks that have forgotten what tenderness feels like. You eat it because you must, chewing longer than seems reasonable. And while you chew, your mind insists on replaying those coastal grills. Meat sizzling, fat dripping into coals with a hiss that sounded like approval. Plantains join the memory, golden and soft inside, crisp at the edges. In port, they were cheap, filling, and faintly sweet, the kind of food that didn't demand attention but rewarded it anyway. On board, sweetness is rationed and joy-adjacent at best. You swallow another mouthful of salted meat and think, not for the first time, that plantains were unfairly good for how simple they were. A quirky tidbit sailors used to pass around was the belief that grilled food near the equator tasted better because the sun helped cook it twice, once in the pan, once in the air. It's nonsense, of course, but it stuck. Historians still argue whether this kind of exaggerated storytelling was simple humor or a way for sailors to cope with long stretches of sensory deprivation. You sit on deck during a rare quiet moment, the sea rolling gently, and imagine the smell again. Smoke mixed with spice, with salt air, with human presence. That's what's missing out here. Not just flavor, but the sense that food is part of a living place. Shipboard meals feel isolated, floating in a vacuum of routine. In African ports, street food was often cooked by the same vendors every day, faces becoming familiar even during short stays. You remember nodding greetings, wordless transactions, the comfort of recognition. Food came with a human rhythm. At sea, meals are issued, not shared. Even when you eat together, the structure feels official, almost ceremonial in its dullness. There's a soft joke among the crew that the ship's cook would cause a small miracle if he ever managed to grill something. Someone adds that the deck would probably catch fire first. You smile. That's joke number 2 today, and it lands gently like everything does out here. Historians still argue how much African coastal cuisine influenced European sailors' tastes long-term. Some claim it barely registered. Others point to later adaptations in port cities back home. For you, the debate feels distant. Influence or not, the memory itself is vivid and persistent. You don't need a recipe, you need the smell. Another fringe detail worth lingering on is that sailors often associated grilled food with freedom. Open flames, outdoor cooking, no walls. On board, everything is enclosed, regulated. Fire is dangerous, controlled, feared. In port, fire was friendly. You realize that part of what you miss is watching food being made, not just receiving it. The days continue their slow procession. Salted meat appears again, boiled this time, gray and steaming weakly. You eat it, then wipe your hands and lean against the rail, letting the breeze cool your face. Somewhere, far behind you, someone is turning a skewer, checking for doneness with practiced ease. Historians still argue whether sailors exaggerated their fondness for African street food in later accounts, shaped by nostalgia and distance. But exaggeration or not, the repetition of these memories across different journals suggests something real. Grilled food, eaten outdoors, tied to place and people, left a mark. You think briefly about how funny it is that memory preserves the good so carefully. You don't remember waiting. You don't remember heat or flies or smoke in your eyes. You remember flavor, warmth, and the feeling of being briefly grounded. That selective editing feels merciful. Night falls again, smooth and quiet. The stars appear, sharp and numerous, and the sea reflects just enough light to feel alive. You lie back and let the ship carry you, the memory of grills fading into something softer, less specific. Not gone, just resting. As sleep edges closer, you imagine the sound of meat sizzling, steady and calm. The sound blends with the water against the hull until they're indistinguishable. You breathe slowly, evenly, letting that imagined warmth settle into you, a reminder that the world is generous in places, even if you're far from them now. The sea opens up, and with it, your memories drift westward again, carried by currents you can't see. The Caribbean arrives in your mind not as a map, but as color. Bright, unapologetic, almost loud compared to the muted palette of ship life. Even now, rocking gently beneath a wide sky, you can almost taste sweetness on the air. Not refined sweetness, not the careful kind, but the bold, sticky joy of street food meant to be eaten without thinking too hard. Caribbean ports during the Age of Sail were famous for their vendors selling fried doughs, fruit, and sugar-heavy snacks to sailors flush with pay and relief at making landfall. This is a mainstream historical fact. Sugar production shaped the region, and its byproducts found their way into everyday foods. You remember fritters fried until crisp, sometimes filled with fruit, sometimes just dusted with sugar, handed over hot enough to demand patience. On board, sugar exists mostly as molasses, thick and dark, added sparingly to porridge or diluted into something resembling a drink. It's functional, not joyful. You sip it now and think about how, in port, sweetness felt like celebration. It marked survival. You made it across the ocean, and your reward was something that stuck to your fingers and made you smile. There's a quirky tidbit sailors like to repeat about Caribbean sweets, that they could lift morale faster than rum. Whether that was true or just an excuse to buy more is up for debate. Historians still argue how much sugar intake actually affected sailors' mood and energy, but contemporary accounts are clear on one thing: they craved it fiercely. You sit with a cup in your hands, watching the horizon stretch endlessly. The sea is calm today, the kind of calm that invites reflection. You think about fruit vendors, pineapple, mango, guava, fruit so ripe it barely held together. In port, you ate it standing, juice running down your wrists, unconcerned with dignity. At sea, fruit is dried, leathery, its sweetness muted and polite. A light joke crosses your mind. Somewhere out there, a pineapple is living its best life, unaware of how much it's missed. You smile and take another sip of your drink, letting the thought drift. Caribbean street food wasn't complicated, but it was immediate. Fried, sweet, hot, or cold, everything arrived fast, without ceremony. Sailors, accustomed to waiting for everything, found that speed intoxicating. Historians still argue whether this quick access to pleasure influenced sailors' later expectations of port life, but it's easy to see why it would. You remember music too, not specific songs, just rhythm. Vendors calling out, laughter, the thud of dough hitting oil. These sounds blended into the taste, inseparable. On the ship, sound is constant but narrow. Wind, wood, water. The absence of human noise is more noticeable than you expected. Another fringe detail worth noting is that sailors often associated Caribbean sweets with rest. Not just physical rest, but mental release. Sugar signaled a pause in vigilance, a moment when you could let your guard down. Historians still argue how accurately sailors remembered these feelings later, but the association appears again and again. As the sun lowers, the sea turns a deeper blue, and the air cools slightly. You feel the gentle fatigue that comes from days blending together. Hunger isn't sharp right now. It's distant, manageable. But the memory of sweetness lingers, softening the edges of the day. Someone nearby mutters about missing fritters specifically, and another voice agrees without hesitation. It's comforting how precise longing can be. You're all missing different things, but sometimes they overlap perfectly. That shared overlap becomes a kind of quiet bond. You lean back and let your eyes close for a moment. The ship rocks, steady and patient. You imagine biting into something warm and sweet, the contrast between crisp outside and soft inside. The image doesn't excite you, it relaxes you. It reminds you that pleasure exists, that it's waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. Historians still argue whether sailors' cravings for sweets increased over the course of long voyages or if they were simply more willing to admit it later. Either way, the truth feels simple. Sweetness is comforting, and comfort is rare at sea. As night settles in, stars emerge one by one, and the Caribbean fades back into memory. But it leaves behind a gentle warmth, like sugar dissolving slowly. You let that warmth spread, letting the rhythm of the ship guide your breathing, and for a while that's enough. The horizon remains empty, but your thoughts drift south again, tracing coastlines you once knew only briefly. South American ports rise gently in your memory. Callao, Cartagena, Salvador. Places where stone quays met warm water and food felt grounding in a way shipboard meals never do. Here, the smells were earthier. Less oil, less sugar. More grain. More steam. A mainstream historical fact is that maize formed the backbone of daily diets across much of South America. And that didn't stop at the dock. Street vendors sold maize cakes, flatbreads, and simple stews thickened with corn or beans, feeding sailors who wanted something warm and filling without ceremony. You remember holding a small cake wrapped in cloth, heat seeping into your palms as you waited for it to cool enough to eat. At sea, warmth is inconsistent. Meals are hot or cold depending on timing and weather, not preference. You spoon up a portion of ship stew, thin, grayish, doing its best, and think about how different it felt to eat something intentionally thick. Maize has weight. It settles you. It doesn't rush through you like watered-down broth. There's a quirky tidbit sailors used to joke about. That corn-based foods made you feel closer to land, even when land was gone. No one could explain why, and no one really tried. Historians still argue whether this belief had any physiological basis or if it was purely symbolic, but it shows how strongly certain foods were tied to emotional grounding. You remember stews simmering slowly, vendors stirring without hurry. In port, time bent around food. On board, food bends around time. That reversal is subtle but exhausting. You eat because the bell rings, not because your body asks. It's efficient, but it's not kind. Another memory surfaces. Beans. Soft, seasoned, sometimes mashed. In South American ports, beans weren't an afterthought. They were a promise. Protein that didn't come from a barrel. You chew on salted meat now and think about how beans once tasted faintly sweet, faintly smoky, depending on how they were cooked. Historians still argue how widespread access to these street foods really was for foreign sailors, especially given language barriers and unfamiliar customs. But journals mention them often, usually with relief. Relief at finding something recognizable even when everything else felt foreign. You sit on deck during a calm afternoon, the sun steady but not harsh. The ship glides, and for a moment, it feels almost peaceful. You imagine a pot simmering on land, thick steam rising, someone tasting and adjusting without measuring. That casual confidence is what you miss most. On board, everything is counted, weighed, rationed. A light joke drifts through your mind. If the ship's cook ever tried to make maize cakes, they'd probably come out square by accident. You smile. Humor like this doesn't need to be shared aloud to work. A fringe detail worth lingering on is how sailors often described South American food as honest. It wasn't flashy, but it didn't pretend to be something else. Historians still argue whether this language reflects actual culinary traits or the sailors' own desire for simplicity after long voyages. Either way, the word shows up again and again. Evenings grow longer as you move through open water. You eat, clean up, and lean against the rail, watching the light fade. The memory of maize-based foods feels heavier than others, more solid. Fish and sweets sparkle in memory. Maize steadies it. You realize that what you miss here isn't excitement, but reassurance. Street foods in these ports made you feel fed in a deeper way, as if someone had thought about balance rather than survival. At sea, survival is the point. Balance is a luxury. Historians still argue whether sailors' fondness for South American street foods influenced later culinary trends back home. Some claim it did, subtly, through returning sailors who recreated flavors as best they could. Others see no trace. For you, the debate fades. Influence or not, the memory matters now. Night comes softly, the sea barely moving. You lie down, letting the ship rock you into stillness. Somewhere in the quiet, you imagine the weight of a warm maize cake in your hands. The thought doesn't wake you. It anchors you gently as sleep edges closer. Your journey continues eastward in memory, drifting toward the coasts of East Asia. Ports bustling with narrow streets, lanterns, and the aroma of food that seems to float rather than sit heavily on your stomach. You can almost feel the humid air pressing gently against your skin, carrying hints of soy, garlic, and something unmistakably fresh. It's the smell of noodles, dumplings, and slow-cooked broths meant to be eaten standing or sitting on tiny stools, amidst a crowd moving with purpose. A mainstream historical fact is that sailors docking in ports like Nagasaki, Canton, or Guangzhou often sought out noodle vendors in street kitchens after long weeks at sea. Noodles were easy to eat quickly, filling, and surprisingly diverse. Broths varied from light and clear to rich and savory, often complemented by pickled vegetables or small steamed buns. You remember holding a small bowl in your hands, steam fogging your vision, slurping carefully but messily, entirely unconcerned with decorum. On the ship, the closest equivalent is something bland and uniform. A watery porridge, a thin broth, a few scattered beans. You taste it now and immediately think of the vendor's cart, the clatter of bowls, the faintly sweet aroma of steamed dough. The contrast is sharp, almost laughable. Historians still argue whether foreign sailors truly embraced local flavors or merely appreciated the novelty. But contemporary journals suggest that curiosity and hunger made for memorable experiences regardless. There's a quirky tidbit sailors like to repeat. In some ports, if you smiled at a noodle vendor, you might get an extra dumpling. That small act of kindness carried weight on long voyages, where small joys were magnified by scarcity. You remember the simplicity of it and wonder how long ago it seems, yet it feels present as you chew on your hardtack. The ship rocks gently, and you notice how your sense of taste is adjusted. At sea, bland becomes tolerable, slightly better than edible. Back on land, even the simplest noodle soup can be astonishing. You recall how the broth would steam and glimmer in the lantern light, each sip warming your hands and your belly. On board, warmth is mostly about preventing scurvy or keeping stew palatable, not pleasure. You think about dumplings for a moment. The labor involved, the precision, the tiny pockets of filling inside dough that's soft, not hard. Sailors describe them as joy in hand-sized parcels. That phrase floats back to you, a gentle whisper of appreciation for skill and care. Historians still argue whether such street foods genuinely influenced sailors' culinary expectations or merely served as episodic pleasures, fleeting yet unforgettable. A fringe detail lingers in your memory. Some sailors believed that eating noodles in certain ports would grant them smooth sailing. Ridiculous, of course, but superstition and appetite intertwined seamlessly. Food often carried symbolic weight, especially when life was largely unpredictable. You remember passing through crowds, noodles in hand, feeling just slightly safer for a few minutes. Night falls, lanterns flicker, and you imagine the soft clatter of bowls fading as the street empties. The memory persists in taste and smell. The faint tang of soy, the warmth of dough, the rhythm of hands shaping dumplings. It's almost musical in your mind, a gentle lull that the monotonous shipboard fare cannot replicate. Somewhere, a crewmate quietly mutters about missing buns, and a ripple of agreement passes through the mess. You smile inwardly, recognizing the universality of this longing. Sailors shared not just food, but stories, gestures, and the quiet satisfaction of remembering meals that grounded them in the world. You take a slow breath, letting the memory of noodles and dumplings fill the spaces that porridge and hardtack cannot. The air smells faintly salty, the water moves steadily, and your thoughts drift along with the ship's rhythm. The world feels vast, full of flavors you've tasted and will never forget, even as your current reality is more uniform and restrained. Historians still argue whether sailors' fondness for East Asian street foods had lasting influence on European culinary practices. But for now, that debate is a gentle hum in the background. What matters is that memory preserves warmth, novelty, and joy in a way the sea cannot take away. As sleep beckons, you imagine a steaming bowl, hands cupped around it, noodles lifting in slow, deliberate slurps. The vision calms you. It settles the mind and body. The ship rocks gently, a lullaby in its own right, and you feel the faint comfort of knowing some pleasures endure, even across oceans. The northern waters call to you next, and your memory drifts toward ports where winter bites with a sharp, polite persistence. Copenhagen, Hamburg, Bergen. Names that bring frost to the mind even as you imagine them under low-hanging gray skies. The smells here are heavier, grounded, carrying the warmth of hearths, smoked meats, and bread baking slowly against the chill. Street food in these ports was about comfort as much as sustenance, the kind that makes you hunch over a steaming bowl just to feel alive again. A mainstream historical fact is that northern European ports relied heavily on hearty, warm fare. Sausages, porridges, thick breads, and occasionally smoked fish sold at street stalls to sailors and dockworkers. Vendors operated near quays and marketplaces, often heating simple meals on small griddles or over charcoal fires. You remember the sensation of standing in the cold, palm wrapped around a small pot of steaming porridge, the heat radiating upward to meet your face and fingers. At sea, meals are bland and lukewarm by comparison. A thin gruel or salted meat does the job, but it doesn't wrap you in warmth. You chew slowly, imagining what it would feel like to hold a little bowl filled with sausage pieces or coarse bread, the kind that fills your hands and not just your stomach. Historians still argue how much sailors romanticize these simple northern comforts, or if nostalgia simply makes them appear warmer in retrospect. A quirky tidbit that persisted among sailors was that cinnamon or clove added to porridge made it taste luxurious, even when the rest of the meal remained austere. A pinch of spice, rare though it was, turned routine into pleasure. You remember that small thrill, standing in a frosty port, watching smoke curl from a vendor's pan. It's funny how tiny details linger longer than major events. The ship creaks as it slices through cold waves, and you notice how your thoughts have grown nostalgic for warmth more than flavor. Hot meals aren't just food, they are signals of life continuing pleasantly, of order against the randomness of weather and waves. On board, warmth is functional. It keeps scurvy away, prevents sickness, and softens hardtack. In port, warmth is choice. It's comfort, indulgence, a small daily miracle. Sailors often spoke of hot sausages and stews in reverent tones, and you understand why. There's humor in the simplicity, something like a sausage saved more moods than a musket. But there's also truth. The comfort of food, remembered or real, can change your perception of hardship. Historians still argue whether street food had a measurable effect on morale or whether it was mostly anecdotal. But contemporary diaries suggest it mattered profoundly. You notice that bread is usually coarse, sometimes rye, often thick enough to hold up against sausage juices or melted butter. You remember biting into it and feeling it give way slowly, the texture grounding, the warmth enveloping. On board, bread is hard, flavorless, and predictable. Hardtack again, a relentless reminder that the dock is gone. The contrast feels almost comical in its extremity. A fringe detail worth imagining is that some northern port vendors would sprinkle herbs on their wares, knowing sailors were transient and unlikely to complain. Parsley, dill, juniper. Small touches that made the street feel lived in. Historians still argue whether these herbs were practical, decorative, or psychological in effect, but the result lingered in memory. You can almost smell it now, faint and reassuring. As the day passes, the sea temperature drops, and so does your mood slightly, but not unpleasantly. You chew another bite of ship stew, warming your hands on the side of the pot. Your mind drifts back to the quay, to the smell of wood smoke and meat, to the gentle chaos of people moving in close but not pressing. You remember the way voices carried, half loud, half melodic, over the frozen cobblestones. It wasn't a market. It was a small, comforting theater. Laughter echoes faintly in your imagination. Someone burns their porridge, someone else haggles over bread, a dog snares a dropped sausage. You smile. Humor is subtle at sea, but here it comes naturally, even in memory. You let it settle alongside the warmth you imagine, creating a double layer of comfort. As night falls fully, the cold air presses against you, but it is softened by memory. You lean back against the rail, eyes half closed, and picture the streets alive with heat, smoke, and people. The sensation isn't sharp. It isn't urgent. It's like being wrapped in a wool blanket you forgot you had, a quiet reassurance that even distant memories can warm you. Historians still argue how accurately sailors remembered the warmth and flavor of northern street foods after months at sea, but the consistency of accounts across journals suggests they were holding on to something real, a sensory anchor in a monotonous, often uncomfortable environment. And for you, that anchor feels steady, comforting, and close enough to touch. Now, as the voyage stretches onward, your thoughts drift to the small comforts that were never about full meals at all, but about drinks, the familiar rituals of coffee, tea, and local brews. Ports from Lisbon to Batavia all had their versions, and sailors often relied on these simple pleasures to punctuate days of monotonous work. The memory hits sharply. The scent of roasted beans, the steam rising from a chipped cup, the warmth radiating into cold hands after a long walk along stone quays. A mainstream historical fact is that sailors frequently consumed coffee, tea, or weak beer in port because it was safe and, for the most part, familiar. On board, water was often brackish, beer was diluted, and tea leaves scarce. Even small cups offered a semblance of normalcy. You sip tepid water on the deck now and imagine the richness of a real brew, hot enough to fog the rim of your cup. There's a quirky tidbit tucked into journals of the era. Some sailors would collect the tiniest scraps of roasted coffee grounds or leftover tea leaves from taverns to sneak aboard. They'd store them carefully in tiny pouches, and weeks later, a pinch could transform dull shipboard water into a fragrant reminder of land. Historians still argue how widespread this practice really was, but it appears often enough to suggest a quiet, persistent ingenuity. The ship rocks gently, and the wind carries a faint saltiness that mixes oddly with the remembered aroma of roasted beans. You think about how coffee houses and tea stalls were more than just places to drink. They were small theaters of social exchange. You could hear laughter, muted debates, and the occasional argument about whose turn it was to buy. On board, you drink in silence, the social theater replaced with the rhythm of routine. A fringe detail. Some sailors believed the strength of a local brew predicted weather or port fortune. If the coffee was strong, the winds would favor your journey. If weak, perhaps trouble loomed. Ridiculous, of course, but superstition and taste were closely intertwined. Historians still argue whether these beliefs were psychological crutches or simply the maritime equivalent of old wives' tales. Either way, the stories persisted. You lean against the rail and imagine yourself in a small port cafe somewhere in Southeast Asia. The floor is uneven, the air humid, and the cups small and chipped. A vendor slides one toward you with a knowing nod. You lift it, and warmth spreads into your fingers, your lips, your chest. Shipboard coffee could not compete. It's functional, not comforting. Humor appears again in the form of an inside joke among sailors. If the ship's coffee were any weaker, it'd be water. You smile, remembering that even small complaints were shared pleasures. Laughter, even muted, became another form of sustenance, filling gaps where flavor and warmth could not. Historians still argue whether sailors longing for familiar drinks influenced the adoption of coffee or tea in port cities elsewhere. Some suggest the habit of craving and storing these beverages subtly spread through maritime networks. For you, the debate is gentle background noise. What matters is the memory of taste, warmth, and small, comforting rituals. Night begins to settle, and your hands wrap around a tepid mug, imagining steam and aroma as a sensory lullaby. The sea hums around you, rhythm steady, constant. You think about the thousands of sailors before you who craved the same, who felt the same quiet joy from small, intentional acts of nourishment. Memory and ritual become one, a companion through monotony and fatigue. You close your eyes briefly and let the imagined warmth of tea and coffee mix with the rocking of the ship. It's a quiet meditation. The taste, the aroma, the ritual, all preserved in memory. Even without the real cup, even without the land, it comforts, stabilizes, and soothes. Historians still argue how much sailors' access to local brews affected morale versus simply passing time. But contemporary accounts repeatedly highlight it as a cherished part of port life. For now, the small pleasure carries you further than any meal. Your thoughts drift now toward a subtler kind of street food, one that blends convenience with flavor. Snacks meant to be eaten quickly, often on the go, sometimes while standing on a dock waiting for cargo to unload. In ports from Lisbon to Malacca, sailors discovered these handheld delights. Pastries stuffed with meats or sweets, skewered meats, and fried dough wrapped in leaves. They were the perfect antidote to hunger between meals and long enough waits to make you forget the clock entirely. A mainstream historical fact is that handheld snacks were ubiquitous in port cities, providing quick energy and an easy way to sample local flavors. Vendors knew exactly what sailors wanted: filling, flavorful, and portable. You remember holding a small pastry, the dough flaking in your fingers, the warmth radiating slowly through your palm. It's striking how immediate the satisfaction felt compared to the routine of shipboard fare. The quirky tidbit is that some sailors had personal rituals with these snacks. They might save a particularly desirable piece to share with a crewmate later, or swap them for favors, stories, or even small items from the ship. Historians still argue whether these exchanges were significant social mechanisms or merely occasional gestures, but journals suggest it happened often enough to be memorable. The ship rocks beneath your feet, and you notice how the memory of handheld treats is tied to movement. You would eat them while walking through crowds, leaning against posts, or balancing near the edge of the quay. On board, every meal is seated, measured, and monotone. There's humor in this contrast. The idea that freedom in eating can feel more nourishing than the food itself. A fringe detail to consider. Some sailors claimed that specific pastries could ward off seasickness if eaten before departure. It's unclear if this was a literal belief, superstition, or just wishful thinking. Historians still argue whether such practices had physiological merit or were primarily psychological comforts. But the repetition of the idea shows how food and well-being became intertwined. You imagine yourself in the bustling streets, pastry in hand, dodging carts and pedestrians, sweat forming lightly on your brow, and laughter bouncing between buildings. The sensation of heat, movement, and anticipation combine to make food an experience rather than a simple act of consumption. At sea, meals are static. Port treats were kinetic, layered, and ephemeral. Humor surfaces quietly as you remember some sailors teasing one another about the precise technique required to eat without spilling juice or filling. 3 small jokes echo through your mind: about flaking dough, about a pastry stolen by a curious dog, and about swapping the last piece for an extra hour on shore leave. The levity is gentle, soothing, and human. Historians still argue whether the widespread love of handheld street foods influenced sailors' later preferences for compact meals aboard ship. Journals hint at it. Crews often improvised with what they had, but the evidence is fragmentary. Still, the human need for convenience and pleasure seems universal, whether on land or at sea. As night falls, You imagine wrapping a small snack in cloth to save for later, the anticipation making it taste better than it possibly could. The ship hums beneath you, a constant, steady presence, while your mind dwells in the warmth of fleeting indulgences. These snacks, small as they were, hold the power to calm, to anchor memory, and to remind you that nourishment can be as much about gesture and ritual as taste. You chew slowly on shipboard rations, imagining texture, warmth, and subtle sweetness. The memory of handheld snacks becomes a gentle hum behind your consciousness, layering with the rhythm of water against wood, the creak of the hull, and the low whisper of the wind. Historians still argue how significant these small street foods were in shaping sailors' long-term culinary memory. For you, the debate is distant. What matters is that even a tiny pastry could create lasting comfort in the midst of monotony. You savor the thought, letting it soothe, letting it carry you forward. The day wears on, and your mind turns inward, lingering on the invisible threads that tie memory to smell. Street foods, you realize, are never just about taste. They are anchored in scent, and scent alone can transport you more efficiently than sight ever could. You remember quays, alleyways, and market squares, each with its own signature smell. Smoky grills, sweet fritters, the tang of pickled vegetables, the faint saltiness of sea air mingling with all of it. These were scents that sailors carried back to ship long after leaving port, stored like precious cargo in the corners of memory. A mainstream historical fact is that smell was often considered the most reliable indicator of food quality in pre-refrigeration times. Vendors relied on scent to attract customers, and sailors learned to judge freshness, doneness, and even price by aroma alone. You breathe slowly, recalling how each whiff seemed to cue a particular texture, temperature, or bite. On board, the smell of food is far more uniform. Salted, preserved, boiled, less dynamic, less alive. There's a quirky tidbit in sailor lore. Some claimed that certain smells could predict the weather. The scent of baking bread was said to forecast calm seas. Smoke from grills hinted at nearby storms. Historians still argue whether these associations were coincidental, anecdotal, or genuinely believed, but they show the imaginative links sailors made between food, environment, and emotion. You notice the ship rocking beneath you and think about how smell connects to touch, too. Steam rising from a freshly cooked meal in port-pressed warmth into your hands, into your face. The smell of fried fish or sweet fritters seemed to vibrate through the air itself. On board, meals are more functional. Odorless, flattened by salt, and muted by distance from fire. You chew, let your stomach absorb the meal, and mentally sprinkle in the memory of scent for richness. Historians still argue about the accuracy of these sensory recollections, but diaries and letters suggest sailors consistently describe smells with more detail than taste or texture. You remember that in West African ports, the smoke of grilled plantains and meats clung to clothes, hair, and skin, and that lingering scent became a badge of place. Even weeks later, it could evoke streets, faces, and conversations. A fringe detail comes to mind. In some Asian ports, sellers would combine aromatics, garlic, ginger, herbs, to create layered smells that told you more than the menu could. Sailors noted these blends, often returning to the same stall simply for the olfactory experience. You imagine inhaling slowly, recognizing each component and remembering the context. The movement of people, the warmth, the tactile sensation of holding a bowl or skewer. Humor drifts in again as you recall one story of a sailor claiming he could identify a port blindfolded just by smell. The crew laughed, half in disbelief, half in admiration. 3 gentle jokes today, each like seasoning, enhancing the otherwise bland monotony of life at sea. As night falls, you lean against the rail, closing your eyes and letting memory fill in missing pieces. Smell, warmth, touch. You remember the hands of vendors, the motion of preparation, and the bustling rhythm of docks. Food was never isolated. It existed in a world of motion, sound, and scent that made the act of eating immersive, almost theatrical. Historians still argue whether the emphasis on olfactory memory reflects actual practice or is a romanticized reconstruction in later journals. For you, the debate is background noise. The scent lingers, and with it, calm, comfort, and a sense of connection to distant shores. Sleep edges closer, and you imagine a street corner, smoke curling, bread baking, meat sizzling, sweet fritters waiting. These scents fold into one another, creating a gentle lullaby. The memory itself becomes a companion, steady and reliable, riding alongside the ship as it hums quietly through the night.